The man stood before the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with an unsettling familiarity. He had seen this face every day of his life, yet at this moment, it felt like a stranger was looking back. The sharp angles of his jaw, the slight furrow in his brow, the quiet tension in his eyes, these were things others may have noticed, but not him. He had spent years glancing at himself without really seeing. There was a time when he thought he knew who he was. His life had followed a pattern set long before he had the chance to question it. He had played his roles well. The son striving for approval, the friend eager to fit in, the worker chasing the next promotion. He had built a version of himself that was easy to present to the world, one that fit neatly into expectations. And yet, beneath the surface, something had always felt off. There was a quiet discontent, a feeling that something was missing, a whisper in the back of his mind that grew louder with each passing year. Now, standing alone in the silence of his own thoughts, he could not ignore it any longer. The mask he had worn for so long felt heavy, suffocating. The truth pressed against his chest, urging him to acknowledge it. He had been avoiding himself. He had buried his true desires, his true ambitions, his true nature beneath layers of compromise and self-deception. And the most painful realization of all was that no one had forced him to do this. He had done it to himself. Most men live in this quiet state of denial, walking through life with a carefully crafted persona while their real selves remain buried beneath obligations and expectations. They avoid true self-examination, fearing what they might uncover. The world gives them distractions, work, relationships, entertainment, so they never have to stop and ask, who am I, really? They chase goals they were told to pursue, follow paths they did not choose, and measure their worth by standards they did not create. And yet, in the quiet moments, the truth remains. They do not truly know themselves. A man cannot become great if he is unwilling to face himself. The strongest men in history were not those who avoided discomfort, but those who confronted it head-on. They did not hide from their weaknesses, they exposed them. They did not pretend to be something they were not, they embraced their truth, no matter how painful. They stood before the mirror and did not look away. To see oneself fully is to understand both strength and limitation, to recognize both potential and failure. It is to strip away the illusions that have been built over years of conditioning and self-deception. It is to acknowledge the man you have become, and decide if that is truly the man you want to be. The mind is a forge, and every experience, every challenge, every moment of self-awareness is fire shaping the raw metal of your potential. Some men fear the heat and remain brittle, avoiding the fire at all costs. Others walk into it willingly, knowing that only through pressure, through discomfort, through the deliberate destruction of false identities, can they emerge stronger, sharper, unbreakable. This book is for the man who is willing to step into the fire. It is for the man who is tired of living in denial, of making excuses, of avoiding his reflection. It is for the man who feels the weight of his own untapped potential and knows that change is no longer a choice, it is a necessity. The road ahead will not be easy. It will require brutal honesty, relentless discipline, and a willingness to face the parts of yourself you have spent years ignoring. But in return, you will gain something greater than any external achievement: ownership of your own life. Before you take another step, pause. Find a mirror. Look into it, not at your appearance, but at your eyes. Hold your own gaze. This is the man you have lived with every day. The man who knows every thought you have ever had, every lie you have ever told yourself, every fear you have ever let control you. Ask yourself one simple question. Am I the man I claim to be? If the answer is no, then you have two choices. You can turn away, go back to the comfortable illusion, and pretend this moment never happened. Or you can face yourself fully, embrace the discomfort, and step onto the path of transformation. The mirror will never lie to you, but it will show you the truth, whether you are ready to see it or not. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Who You Think You Are. He had always believed he knew himself. He was a man of certainty, of calculated choices, of discipline. He had built a life that looked solid from the outside, structured, accomplished, respectable. But something inside him had started to shift. It was subtle at first, like an itch beneath the skin, a quiet question that whispered in the back of his mind. It asked him, "Who are you, really?" At first, he dismissed it. He told himself that he was exactly who he was supposed to be. He was strong, competent, responsible. He was doing what was expected of him, achieving what he had been told would bring success, living the life he had worked hard to create. And yet, the question persisted. Most men build an identity based on external approval. They shape themselves according to the expectations of parents, teachers, friends, and society. They are praised for their achievements, for their obedience, for their ability to fit into the mold that has been given to them. They become the good son, the reliable worker, the successful provider. They learn what earns them admiration, what secures their place in the hierarchy, and they adjust themselves accordingly. But beneath the carefully constructed persona, something gets lost. The raw, untamed core of who they truly are is buried beneath years of conditioning. And eventually, a man wakes up and realizes that he has spent his life living for something that does not belong to him. The illusion is not always obvious. It does not feel like deception. It feels like duty, like responsibility, like the logical progression of life. A man convinces himself that he is in control, that he has chosen his path. But in the quiet moments, when the distractions fade, when the applause dies down, when there is no one left to impress, he feels the emptiness. He wonders why he is restless despite having everything he was told would bring happiness. He questions why he feels disconnected from his own actions, as if he is playing a role instead of living a life. He asks himself why he sometimes feels like a stranger in his own skin. The truth is simple but difficult to accept. He has been living as an illusion, mistaking the version of himself that pleases others for the man he was meant to be. Breaking free from this illusion is not easy. It requires a man to strip away every false belief, every expectation that has shaped him, every lie he has told himself about who he is. It requires him to destroy the mask he has worn for so long that it has fused with his skin. And that is terrifying. Because once a man removes the illusion, he is left with the unknown. He is left without the security of a predefined identity. He is left with raw, unfiltered truth. And truth is not always flattering. It may reveal that he is not as strong as he pretends to be. It may expose that he has been living in fear, avoiding risks, choosing comfort over growth. It may show him that he has wasted time, that he has settled for less, that he has betrayed himself in ways he never dared to admit. But it will also give him something powerful, the opportunity to rebuild himself from the ground up, this time with truth as his foundation. A man who has lived inside an illusion does not need minor adjustments. He does not need surface-level change. He needs to unmake himself so that he can become something real. This is where most men fail. When faced with the choice between comfort and truth, they choose comfort. They retreat back into the illusion, convincing themselves that it is better to live with mild dissatisfaction than to confront the full weight of their own deception. They tell themselves that their life is good enough, that they should be grateful for what they have, that change is unnecessary. But good enough is the enemy of greatness. And gratitude should never be an excuse for stagnation. The strongest men in history did not live inside illusions. They confronted themselves. They questioned everything they had been taught, everything they had accepted as truth. They tore down their false identities and rebuilt themselves, not according to what was expected of them, but according to what was true. If a man wants to step into his full strength, he must ask himself the hardest questions. Am I living as the man I truly am, or as the man I was trained to be? If all external expectations disappeared, who would I become? What parts of myself have I been hiding because they do not fit into the mold I was given? These questions are dangerous. They do not come with easy answers. They may require a man to change everything: his mindset, his career, his relationships, his purpose. But they are necessary. Because the alternative is to spend a lifetime wearing a mask, performing for an audience that never truly mattered, waking up one day and realizing that he never really lived. A man who is willing to confront himself fully, who is willing to strip away the illusion, who is willing to step into the unknown, that man is free. And in the end, that is the only thing that truly matters. Because a life lived inside an illusion is no life at all. Chapter 2. Why Men Fear Their Own Reflection. He had always avoided the mirror. Not in the way that some men do, with self-conscious glances or quick adjustments of their appearance, but in a deeper, more unconscious way. He saw his reflection every day, shaving, getting dressed, passing by shop windows, but he never truly looked. There was always something else to focus on, something to adjust, something to fix. And yet, on the rare occasions when he allowed himself to stop and really hold his own gaze, a strange discomfort stirred inside him. Most men live their entire lives avoiding this moment. They are not afraid of the mirror itself, but of what it forces them to confront. Because a mirror, when looked into with honest eyes, does not flatter. It does not soften the hard truths, does not blur the edges of regret, does not mask the weight of unfulfilled potential. It reflects back everything: the strength, the weakness, the past, the present, and most painfully, the distance between who a man is and who he knows he could be. It is easier to avoid this confrontation. Easier to move through life with distractions, to drown out self-reflection with noise, with work, with achievement, with indulgence. The modern world provides endless escape routes, so many ways to keep running, to keep avoiding, to keep the uncomfortable questions buried beneath a constant stream of stimulation. But no matter how far a man runs, the reflection waits. Because no man, no matter how successful, no matter how disciplined, can truly escape himself. There is a reason men fear looking too closely. To do so means acknowledging the ways in which they have failed themselves, the moments they let fear dictate their choices, the times they compromised their principles for the sake of comfort or approval. It means confronting the dreams they abandoned, the potential they ignored, the battles they backed away from. And it means accepting responsibility, not just for the past, but for what comes next. Most men would rather not see this. They would rather believe that life is something that happens to them, that their circumstances are the result of fate, that they are exactly where they are meant to be. It is easier to blame external forces than to admit that their own choices, their own patterns of avoidance, have shaped their reality. But a man who refuses to see the truth about himself will never be able to change it. The greatest men in history were not those who avoided self-examination. They were the ones who faced it, who stood in front of the mirror and did not look away. They were the ones who acknowledged their flaws, their weaknesses, their mistakes, and used that knowledge as fuel. They understood that strength is not built in denial but in brutal honesty. A man who dares to look at himself with clear eyes may not like what he sees. He may see hesitation where there should have been decisiveness, compromise where there should have been conviction, fear where there should have been courage. But the difference between a weak man and a strong one is not in what they see, it is in what they choose to do next. A weak man sees his flaws and turns away, ashamed, retreating into distractions and justifications. He tells himself that self-reflection is useless, that the past is the past, that there is no point in digging up regrets. He convinces himself that he is fine the way he is, that things will change on their own, that someday, when the time is right, he will become the man he was meant to be. But someday never comes. A strong man sees the same flaws and leans in. He does not turn away, does not flinch, does not allow discomfort to drive him back into the shadows. Instead, he examines his reflection like a craftsman inspects his work, critically, yes, but with the intention to refine, to improve, to sculpt himself into something better. He understands that real change does not come from wishing or waiting but from a deliberate confrontation with reality. The process is not comfortable. It requires a man to sit with his past, to replay his failures not with self-pity but with a cold, analytical eye. It demands that he take inventory of his weaknesses, not to wallow in them but to eliminate them. It forces him to ask the hardest question of all: am I truly living as the man I claim to be? There is no escaping this reckoning. It comes for every man, sooner or later. Some will face it in their youth, and because of it, they will sharpen themselves early, forging a life of strength and purpose. Others will put it off until their later years, when the weight of regret becomes too heavy to ignore. And some will never face it at all, going to their graves never truly knowing who they were, never daring to look deeply enough to find out. The choice is simple, but not easy. A man can continue avoiding the mirror, continue numbing himself with distractions, continue convincing himself that he is exactly who he pretends to be. Or he can stop, turn, and look, really look. He can strip away the illusions, the justifications, the excuses, and see himself for exactly what he is. And then, armed with that truth, he can decide what comes next. Chapter 3. Breaking the Cycle of Self-Doubt. He had always felt it, even in his strongest moments, the quiet, insidious voice of doubt. It wasn't loud, nor did it scream for his attention. It was subtle, creeping into his thoughts in moments of hesitation, whispering just loudly enough to make him question himself. Are you sure? What if you fail? What if you're not good enough? He told himself he was confident, that he trusted his abilities, that he was capable. But doubt has a way of digging in deep, of planting itself in the cracks of certainty and spreading like vines through a man's mind. And like so many others, he had unknowingly watered those vines for years, allowing them to grow stronger, to wrap around his actions, to tighten their grip each time he hesitated. Self-doubt is not always obvious. It does not always manifest as fear or insecurity. Sometimes, it disguises itself as logic, as caution, as wisdom. It convinces a man that he is merely being practical, that he is weighing his options, that he is simply waiting for the right time. But deep down, he knows the truth. It is not logic holding him back, it is fear. He had spent his life watching other men move with certainty, wondering what it was that made them different. Were they smarter? More talented? Luckier? No. The difference was simpler than that. They had learned a truth that had taken him years to understand. Confidence is not something you are born with. It is something you build. And self-doubt? It is something you train yourself to overcome. From the time a boy learns to walk, he is trained to seek approval. Approval from parents, from teachers, from peers. Every action he takes is met with either praise or correction, teaching him, whether he realizes it or not, to measure his worth by the reactions of others. Over time, he internalizes these reactions, and they become his inner voice. The voice that tells him what is possible, what is acceptable, what is within his reach. Some boys grow up being told they can do anything. Their failures are framed as lessons, their mistakes as stepping stones. They develop a voice that encourages, that pushes them forward even in the face of setbacks. Others are not so lucky. They are criticized more than they are praised, their failures seen as proof of their limitations. And slowly, the voice inside them turns against them, not as an ally but as an enemy. No man escapes self-doubt entirely. Even the strongest men, the most disciplined, the most accomplished, hear that voice from time to time. But the difference between men who succeed and men who stagnate is in how they respond. The weak man listens to the voice and obeys. He hesitates, he second-guesses, he convinces himself that now is not the right time. The strong man hears the voice, acknowledges it for what it is, and moves forward anyway. The truth about self-doubt is that it is nothing more than untested fear. It thrives in inaction, growing stronger with every hesitation, every excuse, every moment of avoidance. But the moment a man decides to act in spite of it, the illusion begins to shatter. He had experienced this before in small ways, though he hadn't realized it at the time. The first time he took on a challenge that scared him, the first time he stepped into discomfort, the first time he forced himself to do something before he felt ready. Each of those moments chipped away at doubt. And after enough of them, he noticed something. The voice had not disappeared, but it had lost its power. The greatest enemy of self-doubt is proof. When a man builds proof, through action, through discipline, through repeated confrontation with fear, he changes the way he sees himself. He no longer needs to convince himself that he is capable because his actions have already proven it. The mistake most men make is in waiting for confidence before taking action. They believe they must first feel certain, first be fully prepared, before they can move forward. But confidence is not a requirement, it is a byproduct. It does not come before action. It comes because of action. He thought about all the times he had waited, the moments he had told himself he wasn't ready yet. How many opportunities had he let pass by, all because he was waiting for a feeling that was never going to come? Confidence does not appear in a man's life like a gift from the heavens. It is built, brick by brick, through small victories. And the only way to begin is to move forward before you feel ready. The cycle of self-doubt is vicious, but it is also fragile. It is held together by inaction, by hesitation, by the false belief that uncertainty means stop. But a man who learns to act despite his doubts, who moves forward even when the voice whispers, who gathers proof instead of waiting for permission, he is the man who breaks free. For years, he had been looking at confidence as something others had, something he lacked. But the truth was simpler. Confidence is earned. And self-doubt? It is nothing more than an invitation to prove yourself wrong. Chapter 4. The hardest question. What do you really want? For years, he had been moving forward. He had followed the rules, checked the boxes, built the life that he had been told would make him successful, respectable, and secure. He had done everything right, yet something inside him felt hollow. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on a path that wasn't truly his. But he had never stopped long enough to ask the question that mattered most. What do you really want? It was the kind of question that made men uncomfortable, that forced them to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. Because if a man had to admit to himself that the life he was living wasn't the one he wanted, what then? What did that say about the years spent pursuing things that didn't fulfill him? About the sacrifices made in the name of a future that no longer felt right? Most men avoid the question altogether. It is easier to convince yourself that you are happy with what you have, that you are content with where you are, than to admit that something is missing. Because once you admit it, you can never unsee it. The discomfort of that truth will follow you everywhere, at work, at home, in moments of quiet. It will press against your chest, urging you to act. And that is what most men fear. Not the question itself, but what it demands. From the time he was young, he had been told what success looked like. It was a good job, a steady income, a respectable reputation. It was stability, responsibility, a life without risk. And for years, he had pursued that vision, believing it to be his own. But lately, he had begun to wonder, was it really what he wanted, or had he just been conditioned to want it? The difference between a man who is truly fulfilled and a man who is merely existing is not luck, not intelligence, not even discipline. It is clarity. The men who build powerful, meaningful lives are not the ones who work the hardest or who follow the safest path. They are the ones who know, without hesitation, exactly what they want. And clarity is rare, because it requires a man to strip away every external expectation, every conditioned belief, every pressure to conform, and ask himself, if nothing else mattered, if no one else's opinion influenced me, what would I choose? It is a terrifying question because the answer may reveal that everything he has been chasing was never truly his dream. It may require him to change directions, to abandon comfort, to start over. But the alternative, the slow, suffocating realization that he spent his life living for someone else's vision, is far worse. For most of his life, he had mistaken movement for progress. He had kept himself busy, working, building, striving, never questioning whether the destination was one he had chosen or one that had been chosen for him. It wasn't until he stopped, until he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own dissatisfaction, that he realized the truth. He had been running on autopilot. He had been following a script he never wrote. But how does a man begin to uncover what he truly wants? Not the surface-level desires, not the things he has been told to chase, but the deep, undeniable purpose that drives him? The answer is simpler than most men expect. It does not come from endless thinking, from analysis, from debating every possibility. It comes from listening to the moments that make him feel alive. There had been glimpses of it, times when he had lost himself in an activity, moments when time disappeared, when he felt more like himself than at any other time. The problem was, he had ignored those moments, dismissing them as hobbies, as impractical, as unrealistic. But those moments held the key. Because true desire does not shout, it whispers. And the men who listen to it, who follow where it leads, are the ones who build extraordinary lives. The fear of admitting what he truly wanted had always been that it might not be possible. That pursuing it would require risk, change, sacrifice. But what he had failed to realize was that everything worth having demands sacrifice. He had already been sacrificing his time, his energy, his life, for things that did not fulfill him. The real question was not whether he was willing to sacrifice, but whether he was sacrificing for the right things. He thought about the men he admired, the ones who moved with certainty, who carried themselves with an unshakable sense of purpose. They were not men who had blindly followed the path laid out for them. They were men who had chosen, deliberately, what they wanted, and pursued it without apology. And that was the difference. Most men drift through life, waiting for clarity to find them. But clarity does not come from waiting. It comes from deciding. From choosing, right now, to no longer accept a life that feels empty. From having the courage to ask, what do I truly want? And to keep asking until the answer is undeniable. There is no perfect moment to start. There is no external sign that will point the way. There is only the quiet recognition that a man cannot build a meaningful life if he is unwilling to be honest about what he truly desires. And so, he made a choice. No more running. No more ignoring the question. No more pretending that he was satisfied with less than what he truly wanted. Because a man who knows what he wants is a man who cannot be stopped. Chapter 5. The Inner Critic. Friend or enemy? The voice had been with him for as long as he could remember. It was there when he hesitated before speaking up, when he doubted himself before taking a risk, when he replayed past mistakes in his mind like a film he couldn't turn off. It spoke in moments of stillness, when there were no distractions to drown it out. It whispered the same words, over and over again. You're not good enough. You always mess things up. You'll never be the man you want to be. At first, he thought this voice was normal, something every man carried. And maybe it was. But normal did not mean healthy. Because the more he listened to it, the more it shaped him. The more he obeyed its warnings, the more he shrank, the more he hesitated, the more he chose comfort over challenge, safety over growth. It wasn't until years later, when he met men who moved differently, men who carried themselves with an unshakable certainty, that he began to question if the voice was lying to him. These men didn't seem to be ruled by doubt. They made decisions quickly, acted without hesitation, walked into rooms as if they belonged there. He wondered if they had ever struggled with self-doubt, if their inner voices had ever tried to hold them back. Or maybe their voices had been trained to say something different. Self-criticism, he realized, was not the problem. The problem was that his inner voice had turned against him, had become an enemy instead of an ally. It no longer pushed him to be better, it only reminded him of his failures. It no longer guided him, it only questioned him. He had spent years obeying it, assuming that it was protecting him, keeping him from embarrassment, from rejection, from failure. But what it had really been doing was keeping him small. No man is born with self-doubt. A child does not hesitate before trying something new. He does not question whether he is good enough, does not fear looking foolish, does not hold back out of fear of failure. He simply acts. He learns by doing. If he falls, he gets back up. If he stumbles, he tries again. But over time, the voice begins to form. Maybe it comes from a father who is too harsh, a teacher who dismisses his ideas, a failure that cuts too deep. Maybe it comes from the constant comparison to others, from the fear of standing out, from the realization that the world does not reward every effort with success. Whatever the source, the effect is the same, the voice grows stronger, and the man begins to doubt himself. He had seen men who were completely ruled by their inner critic. Men who, despite their intelligence, their potential, their capability, never took action because they had convinced themselves they would fail. They were not weak. They were not incapable. They were simply prisoners of their own minds. But he had also seen men who had trained their inner voices into something powerful. Men whose thoughts did not attack them, but challenged them. Their inner critics did not say, "You're not good enough." Instead, they said, "Get better." They did not say, "You're going to fail." Instead, they said, "If you fail, you'll learn. Keep moving." They did not say, "You're weak." Instead, they said, "Then become stronger." The difference between a man who is ruled by doubt and a man who is fueled by it is not in their thoughts. It is in how they respond to them. The voice of self-criticism will always be there. No man escapes it entirely. But it can be trained. It can be rewired. The first step was recognizing that the voice was not always truthful. It spoke in absolutes, in exaggerations, in distortions. It focused on failures while ignoring successes. It made him feel as though he was the sum of his mistakes, as though every flaw was permanent. But when he really examined its words, he saw the flaws in its logic. Had he really always failed? No. Had he really never been strong enough? No. Had he really never improved? Of course he had. The second step was refusing to obey it without question. For years, he had accepted its words as reality. If the voice said he was not ready, he waited. If it said he was not good enough, he held back. But what if the voice was wrong? What if he took action despite it? What if he stepped forward anyway? The first time he did this, the voice grew louder, warning him that he was making a mistake. But then, something surprising happened. Nothing catastrophic followed. He survived. He moved forward. And the voice, for the first time, began to weaken. The final step was reshaping the voice entirely. If the voice could be trained to attack him, it could also be trained to build him. He did not need to eliminate self-criticism, he only needed to redirect it. He began responding to the voice with a new set of words. When it said, "You're not good enough," he replied, "Then I will become better." When it said, "You're going to fail," he replied, "Then I will learn and keep going." When it said, "You're weak," he replied, "Then I will get stronger." At first, it felt unnatural. But over time, as he acted in alignment with his new voice, it became his default mindset. The voice of doubt was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It had become something different, not an enemy, but a force that drove him forward. There are men who live their entire lives obeying a voice that was never meant to lead them. They remain trapped, waiting for confidence to magically appear, for doubt to disappear, for the perfect moment when they finally feel ready. But that moment never comes. And then there are men who take control. Men who refuse to let self-doubt dictate their actions. Men who train their inner voices until they push them forward rather than hold them back. These are the men who build unshakable confidence, not because they are free from doubt, but because they have learned to move forward despite it. He no longer waited for confidence. He created it. He no longer feared failure. He used it. And when the voice inside him whispered that he wasn't good enough, he only had one response. Watch me. Chapter 6. Rebuilding Your Confidence from the Inside Out. There was a time when he thought confidence was something men either had or didn't. He believed that some were born with an unshakable certainty in themselves, while others, himself included, had to fight for every ounce of self-belief. He had spent years watching men who seemed immune to doubt, men who walked into rooms and commanded attention without effort, men who never hesitated before making decisions. He assumed they had something he lacked. Maybe it was natural charisma. Maybe they had grown up with fathers who instilled an unbreakable sense of worth in them. Maybe they had never tasted real failure, never questioned themselves, never let the weight of their own thoughts hold them down. But then, he began to look closer. He started to notice the way these men carried themselves, the way they spoke, the way they moved. He saw that their confidence was not something they had been gifted, but something they had built. It was not an accident. It was the result of years of deliberate action, of training, of conditioning. And if confidence could be built, then it could also be rebuilt. The problem was, he had spent too long trying to find confidence in the wrong places. Like many men, he had looked for it in external validation, in achievement, in the approval of others. He thought that if he could just accomplish enough, if he could just get enough recognition, then the doubt would disappear. But no matter how much he achieved, no matter how many compliments he received, the doubt always returned. Because external confidence is fragile. It is built on the shifting sands of other people's opinions, on circumstances outside of one's control. The moment something goes wrong, a failure, a rejection, a setback, it crumbles. Real confidence, the kind that cannot be broken, does not come from the outside. It comes from within. It is not built on praise, but on proof. Not on what others think, but on what you know about yourself. The men who carried themselves with certainty did not do so because the world had always rewarded them. They did so because they had proven to themselves, over and over again, that they could trust their own strength. He knew, then, that if he wanted to rebuild his confidence, he had to stop chasing validation and start creating his own proof. The first step was keeping his own word to himself. For years, he had made silent promises in his mind. He would wake up early and train. He would take the risk. He would break the bad habit. But when the moment came to act, he would hesitate, make excuses, delay. Each time he did this, a small piece of his self-trust eroded. Confidence is nothing more than self-trust. A man who trusts himself moves with certainty. A man who has broken his own word too many times cannot. So he began with small things. If he said he would wake up at 5 a.m., he woke up at 5 a.m. If he said he would do 50 push-ups, he did 50. If he committed to a challenge, he followed through, not because anyone was watching, but because he was watching. And as he did this, something began to change. He no longer had to convince himself that he was capable, he had proof. He no longer needed external validation, he had internal certainty. He began to walk with the quiet confidence of a man who does what he says he will do. The second step was confronting failure directly. For too long, he had feared failure. He had avoided it, planned around it, done everything he could to minimize the chance of looking foolish or falling short. But the men who were truly confident were not those who had never failed. They were those who had failed more than anyone else and survived. So he made failure a goal. He sought out situations that challenged him, that tested him, that forced him to risk embarrassment. He stepped into discomfort willingly, knowing that each time he failed and got back up, he was rewiring his mind to see failure as fuel rather than proof of weakness. And soon, he noticed something surprising. The more he failed, the stronger he became. The fear began to fade, replaced by the knowledge that he could handle whatever came his way. Because real confidence is not the belief that you will never fail, it is the certainty that failure will never break you. The third step was building his competence through relentless repetition. A man who doubts himself is not weak. He is simply untested. He looked at the areas of his life where he lacked confidence and asked himself a simple question: have I put in the reps? A man who hesitates to speak in public is not bad at speaking. He has simply not spoken enough times to trust himself. A man who doubts his strength in the gym is not weak. He has simply not trained long enough to prove his own ability. A man who questions whether he can lead is not incapable. He has simply not put himself in enough leadership roles to gain certainty. So he stopped wondering, stopped overanalyzing, stopped waiting for the feeling of confidence to arrive. Instead, he put in the reps. He spoke even when his voice shook. He trained even when he was tired. He took action even when doubt whispered in his ear. And after enough reps, the doubt began to disappear, not because he had silenced it, but because he had replaced it with something stronger. Confidence is not a feeling. It is a byproduct of action. The mistake most men make is in waiting for confidence before they act. But confidence does not come first. Action comes first. Confidence follows. The man he had once been was full of hesitation, questioning, second-guessing. The man he was becoming no longer asked, "Can I do this?" Instead, he simply did it. Because the answer to self-doubt is not thinking. It is doing. There are men who will spend their entire lives waiting to feel ready. And there are men who understand that readiness is a lie, that the only way to build confidence is to step forward before you feel ready. He made a choice. No more waiting. No more hesitation. No more seeking permission. Because confidence is not given. It is earned. And once a man has truly earned it, it can never be taken away. Chapter 7. The Mirror Test. Owning your weaknesses without excuses. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at the reflection that had been with him his entire life. He saw the familiar lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the weight in his eyes that only he could recognize. It wasn't just exhaustion or age. It was something deeper. A quiet knowledge that he had, for far too long, avoided looking at himself with complete honesty. He had built strength in many ways, developed discipline, overcome obstacles, and yet there was something that always seemed to hold him back. It was not the world, nor bad luck, nor external circumstances. It was himself, the parts of himself he had refused to confront, the weaknesses he had excused, the truths he had ignored because they were too uncomfortable to accept. Most men avoid this test. They prefer to see themselves in the best light, to filter their flaws through justification, to downplay the areas where they fall short. They do not acknowledge their laziness, they call it being worn out. They do not admit their lack of courage, they call it being practical. They do not recognize their avoidance of risk, they call it being responsible. But no man ever grew stronger by lying to himself. He remembered all the times he had told himself he was doing his best, when he knew he wasn't. The times he had blamed the situation instead of admitting he had not prepared well enough. The moments when he had excused his lack of action as patience, when in reality, it had been fear. For years, he had assumed that self-improvement meant focusing on strengths, reinforcing what he was already good at. But the men who became truly powerful, truly unbreakable, did not just develop strengths. They eliminated their weaknesses. They did not look away from their flaws. They faced them. The first time he had done this, it had been brutal. He had listed out everything, every flaw, every habit that was making him weak, every pattern of avoidance, every time he had betrayed himself by choosing comfort over growth. It was not easy, but it was necessary. To build strength, a man must first acknowledge where he is weak. There is a difference between weakness and excuses. Every man has weaknesses. But only a certain kind of man takes ownership of them and does something about it. The rest make excuses. They rationalize, they minimize, they find ways to justify staying exactly as they are. He had seen it in other men before. The ones who said they didn't have time to get in shape but somehow had hours for distractions. The ones who blamed the system for their lack of success, never admitting that their own inconsistency was the real problem. The ones who said they wanted to change but refused to take the first step. Weakness, when ignored, does not stay the same. It grows. It infiltrates every aspect of life, affecting confidence, decision-making, discipline. The man who refuses to address his weaknesses does not just remain weak, he becomes weaker. The truth was harsh but undeniable. A man could either own his weaknesses and overcome them, or let them own him. So he stopped making excuses. He stopped explaining away his shortcomings. He stopped blaming the past, blaming other people, blaming anything outside of himself. Because no one was coming to fix him. No external force was going to reach into his life and correct what he had neglected. That responsibility was his alone. He began attacking his weaknesses with the same intensity he had once reserved for his strengths. If he was out of shape, he trained. If he lacked confidence in his decisions, he started making them with conviction. If he had avoided difficult conversations, he forced himself to have them. He built himself not by reinforcing what he was already good at, but by destroying what was making him weak. The transformation was slow at first, but he began to notice something. His confidence grew, not because he told himself he was improving, but because he had proof. He no longer had to pretend he was strong. He was becoming strong. Most men will never take this step. They will continue living behind justifications, convinced that their flaws are not their fault. They will remain at war with themselves, never fully stepping into their power because they are too afraid of what they might see if they look too closely. But the few who do, the men who dare to stand in front of the mirror with brutal honesty, those men become unstoppable. Because a man who owns his weaknesses has no blind spots. A man who has destroyed his excuses has nothing left to hide behind. And a man who has conquered himself can conquer anything. So he looked in the mirror once more, no longer with avoidance, no longer with hesitation. He was ready to face everything. Because the only way to win the war within was to stop pretending the battle didn't exist. Chapter 8. Destroying the Fear of Judgment. For as long as he could remember, he had been aware of other people's eyes. Whether in a room full of strangers or among friends, there was always a silent presence, the weight of their opinions, the possibility of their approval or disapproval. Even when he told himself he didn't care, a small part of him did. It was a subtle but constant force, shaping his actions, influencing his words, making him second-guess decisions that should have been his alone. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, the choices he made, even the risks he took or avoided, all were filtered, in some way, through the imagined reactions of others. He had spent years thinking this was normal. Everyone worried about what others thought. It was part of being human, part of navigating the world. But then he saw men who moved differently. These were the men who spoke with conviction, who acted without hesitation, who carried themselves with a certainty that was not based on approval but on an unshakable trust in themselves. They did not shrink to fit into spaces that were too small for them. They did not wait for permission. They did not hesitate out of fear of what others might say. He wondered how they did it. How they silenced the fear of judgment. How they walked into any room with confidence, not arrogance, but a quiet, steady presence that said, "I am exactly who I choose to be, and I do not need your approval." The answer was not that they had been born different. It was not that they had never faced criticism, never been mocked, never felt the sting of rejection. They had simply learned a lesson that most men never do. Judgment is inevitable, but obedience to it is a choice. He thought about all the times he had held himself back, not because he lacked the ability, but because he feared how he would be perceived. The opportunities he had let slip away, the words he had swallowed, the chances he had avoided, all in an effort to avoid being judged. But avoiding judgment is a losing battle. No matter what a man does, he will be judged. If he stands tall, he will be called arrogant. If he remains quiet, he will be called weak. If he takes risks, people will question his decisions. If he plays it safe, they will call him uninspired. There is no version of life in which a man is completely free from the opinions of others. But there is a version in which those opinions no longer have power over him. The only way to destroy the fear of judgment is to stop seeking a way to avoid it. Instead, a man must make a choice to live by his own standards, no matter what anyone else says. It was not easy at first. The habit of filtering his actions through the expectations of others was deeply ingrained. But he started small. He stopped hesitating before speaking his mind. He made decisions without running them through the imaginary opinions of people who were not living his life. He stopped explaining himself when he had nothing to explain. At first, the discomfort was overwhelming. The old instinct, the one that told him to conform, to soften his edges, to play it safe, still whispered in his ear. But the more he ignored it, the weaker it became. And something interesting happened. Some people admired his certainty. Others resented it. Some respected his boldness. Others criticized it. But the most surprising realization was that most people didn't care as much as he had thought they would. The judgment he had feared for so long had been mostly in his own head. Most people were too consumed with their own lives, their own insecurities, their own battles to spend much time analyzing his choices. The rare few who did. They were never worth listening to in the first place. The men who allow the fear of judgment to rule them live small lives. They hold back their opinions, their ambitions, their true selves, afraid that stepping outside of the acceptable will invite criticism. And they are right. It will. But what they fail to see is that playing it safe is its own kind of failure. The cost of avoiding judgment is a lifetime of being half of what you could be. He had spent too many years worrying about how others perceived him. But he would spend no more. Because the only man whose judgment mattered was the one staring back at him in the mirror. Chapter 9. The Discipline to Reinvent Yourself. There came a moment when he realized that everything he wanted, every goal, every version of himself he had envisioned, every shred of greatness he had ever dreamed of, was within his reach. Not in the way that motivational slogans promised, not in some vague, wishful thinking kind of way, but in the most direct, brutal, and liberating way possible. He could have it. But only if he was disciplined enough to earn it. That was the difference between the man he was and the man he wanted to become. Not talent. Not luck. Not some magical, uncontrollable force. Discipline. For years, he had tried to change himself in bursts of motivation, in moments of inspiration that hit like a rush of adrenaline. He would set new goals, write down plans, declare to himself that this time would be different. And for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, he would move with purpose. But eventually, as always, the fire would die out. The old habits would creep back in. The excuses would whisper in his ear. He would tell himself that he was too tired, that he needed a break, that he would start again next week. And each time, he slipped a little further away from the man he could have been. He saw the same pattern in other men. They wanted to be stronger, but they only trained when they felt like it. They wanted to be successful, but they only worked hard when it was convenient. They wanted discipline, but they waited for motivation to push them. And that was the fatal mistake. The men who reinvent themselves, who reshape their bodies, their minds, their entire identities, do not wait to feel ready. They do not rely on the fleeting high of motivation. They build something deeper, something stronger. They build discipline. Discipline is the ability to move forward without permission from your emotions. It is the ability to do what needs to be done, regardless of how you feel. It is waking up early when you want to sleep in. It is training when you don't feel strong. It is working when you are uninspired, showing up when you don't feel like it, staying committed when every part of you wants to quit. And it is in those moments, the ones where weakness whispers in your ear, where your body pleads for comfort, where your mind tells you to stop. It is in those moments that a man is forged. He had seen men who convinced themselves that discipline was too rigid, too suffocating, too restricting. They wanted to be free, to live without routine, without structure. But he had learned the truth. There is no freedom without discipline. A man without discipline is a slave, to his impulses, to his emotions, to his weaknesses. He drifts through life, controlled by whatever he feels in the moment. He starts and stops, builds and destroys, never making real progress because he lacks the ability to stay the course when things get hard. But a disciplined man? He is free. Free from the chaos of inconsistency. Free from the guilt of broken promises to himself. Free from the regret of never following through. Because discipline is not punishment. It is power. The moment he accepted this, his life changed. He no longer made decisions based on how he felt. He no longer asked himself if he wanted to do something. The answer did not matter. He did it anyway. Discipline became his anchor. In moments of doubt, in days of exhaustion, when motivation was nowhere to be found, it was discipline that kept him moving forward. Most men spend their lives waiting for the right time to change. They tell themselves they will start next week, next month, next year. They wait for inspiration, for some external force to push them. But the truth is brutal and simple. Nothing will change until you decide to make it change. And once that decision is made, there is only one thing left: the discipline to follow through. Chapter 10. Making Peace with Your Past Mistakes. He had spent years running from his past. Not in a physical sense. He wasn't the type to avoid responsibility, but in the way that most men do, by burying it beneath distraction and silence. He told himself that what was done, that the past could not be changed, that there was no point in looking back. But the past does not disappear just because a man refuses to acknowledge it. It lingers, shaping his thoughts, influencing his decisions, tightening its grip around his mind in ways he cannot always see. It shows itself in his hesitation, in his self-doubt, in the quiet voice that whispers, "You've failed before. What makes you think this time will be different?" Every man carries the weight of his past mistakes. The failures, the missed opportunities, the things he should have done but didn't, the things he did but shouldn't have. And no matter how much time passes, those moments do not simply vanish. They become part of him, woven into the fabric of his identity. For a long time, he had convinced himself that the best way to deal with his past was to ignore it. He believed that if he focused only on the future, he could outrun the weight of regret. But no man outruns himself. No matter how far he runs, his past follows. And the more he tries to ignore it, the more power it has over him. The strongest men he had ever met were not those who had never made mistakes. They were the ones who had faced their mistakes head-on, who had accepted them fully, who had found a way to turn them into fuel rather than chains. He had to do the same. So he stopped running. He forced himself to look back, to revisit the moments he had avoided, to acknowledge the times he had fallen short. And it was uncomfortable. It was painful. But it was necessary. Because the truth was, his mistakes had already shaped him. They had already left their mark. The only question was whether they would shape him into something stronger or something weaker. A man has two choices when it comes to his past. He can let it define him, let it convince him that he is nothing more than his worst moments, let it keep him locked in the same patterns, afraid to move forward. Or he can own it. He can take full responsibility, not just for what happened, but for what comes next. The mistake itself is never the problem. Every man fails. Every man makes poor decisions. Every man has moments of weakness. The problem is what follows. Does he learn? Does he change? Or does he repeat the same cycle, blaming the world, blaming others, blaming circumstances, while refusing to look in the mirror? Ownership is the only way forward. It is not about self-punishment. It is not about drowning in regret. It is about looking at the past with clear eyes and saying, "Yes, I did that. I made that mistake. I failed. And because of that, I know what must be done differently." The moment he did this, something shifted. The past no longer felt like a weight. It became a lesson, a tool, a foundation upon which he could build something stronger. Regret is a useless emotion if it does not lead to action. Wishing things had been different changes nothing. The only thing that changes the future is learning from the past and refusing to repeat it. So he made a choice. No more running. No more excuses. No more allowing his past to control him in the present. Because a man who has made peace with his past is a man who cannot be broken. Chapter 11. The Power of Forgiving Yourself. For the longest time, he thought punishment was the only way forward. He believed that if he carried his mistakes heavily enough, if he reminded himself of them often enough, if he felt enough guilt, he could somehow balance the scales. He had convinced himself that suffering for his past failures was a necessary part of growth. But guilt is a cage, and he had locked himself inside it. He saw it in other men too, the way they carried their shame like a hidden wound, never allowing it to fully heal, never allowing themselves to move past it. Some wore it as quiet regret, a weight they bore in silence. Others turned it into self-destruction, sabotaging their own lives because, deep down, they didn't believe they deserved better. But the truth he had avoided for so long was this: a man cannot build a new life while he is still punishing himself for the old one. There is a difference between learning from your past and letting it control you. Growth requires reflection, self-awareness, and the willingness to take responsibility for your actions. But there comes a point where carrying guilt serves no purpose. It no longer makes you better, it only keeps you stuck. He had to ask himself, how much longer will I keep paying for mistakes that cannot be undone? Self-forgiveness is not weakness. It is not pretending that past failures do not matter. It is accepting the truth, making amends if necessary, and then making the conscious decision to move forward. But most men do not forgive themselves. They let their past define them. They allow the mistakes they once made to dictate their identity, believing that they will always be the man who failed, the man who made the wrong choice, the man who wasn't strong enough. And in doing so, they chain themselves to a version of themselves that no longer exists. He had to break that chain. He had to recognize that the man who made those mistakes was not the same man standing here today. Growth meant change, and change meant he was no longer bound by who he used to be. For the first time, he allowed himself to see his past without judgment. He saw the moments of weakness, the bad decisions, the regrets, but he also saw something else. He saw the lessons, the transformation, the strength he had gained from enduring those experiences. He realized that every great man had moments he was not proud of. Every strong man had fallen before. Every leader, every warrior, every legend in history had once been just another man who had made mistakes. But the difference between those who rise and those who remain broken is simple. Some men hold on to their past. Others let it fuel them. He made a choice. He would not allow his past to control him any longer. He would take every mistake, every regret, every ounce of pain, and forge it into something stronger. Because a man who has forgiven himself is a man who is truly free. Chapter 12. The Strength of Walking Alone. He had always believed that strength came from standing with others, from being surrounded by a tribe, from having the approval and support of those around him. He had spent years seeking validation, mistaking connection for security, believing that the more people who stood beside him, the stronger he would be. But true strength is not found in numbers. It is found in solitude. There comes a time in every man's life when he must walk alone. Not because he wants to, but because the path ahead is one that no one else can walk for him. Growth is not a group activity. Becoming the man he was meant to be would require a level of isolation that most men are too afraid to face. Most men avoid solitude, mistaking it for loneliness. They surround themselves with people, with distractions, with noise, because in the silence, they are forced to confront themselves. They are forced to sit with their own thoughts, to hear the voices they have spent years drowning out. He had been one of them. For years, he had filled every empty space with something: work, relationships, entertainment, anything to avoid being alone with his own mind. Because in those quiet moments, the truth became too loud to ignore. The truth about who he was. The truth about what he had avoided. The truth about the man he had become versus the man he knew he could be. But running from solitude does not make a man stronger. It makes him dependent. A man who cannot be alone is a man who does not truly know himself. So he stopped running. He forced himself to embrace the silence, to step away from the world, to strip away every external influence so that he could hear his own thoughts clearly. He walked alone, not forever, but for long enough to understand himself without the filter of other people's opinions. And in that solitude, he discovered something. The men who achieve the most, who rise the highest, who become truly unshakable, are the ones who are not afraid to be alone. They are not afraid to think for themselves, to stand on their own principles, to trust their own instincts. Because a man who has walked through solitude, who has faced himself fully, who has learned to rely only on his own strength, is a man who cannot be broken. He no longer needed constant validation. He no longer sought approval. He no longer feared standing alone in his beliefs, his decisions, his vision. Because he had been through the fire of solitude. And he had emerged stronger than ever before. Chapter 13. Redefining Success on Your Own Terms. For years, he had chased success without ever questioning what it truly meant. He had followed the script handed to him: work hard, make money, build status, gain recognition. He had told himself that once he reached a certain level, once he had enough, once he was respected by the world, he would finally feel complete. But when he got there, when he checked all the boxes, when he stood where he had once dreamed of standing, something unexpected happened. The satisfaction was fleeting. The feeling of accomplishment faded faster than he had expected. And the hunger that had driven him was replaced by something else: emptiness. He had done everything he was supposed to do. He had achieved what others admired. And yet, a quiet voice inside him asked a question he was not prepared for: is this it? The world had given him a definition of success, but he had never stopped to define it for himself. Most men live their lives chasing a version of success that is not their own. They follow the patterns set by society, by their families, by the expectations of others. They work toward goals they never questioned, convinced that achieving them will bring fulfillment. But true success is not measured in numbers. It is not found in wealth alone, or status, or recognition. It is found in alignment, in the quiet certainty that a man is living in accordance with his own values, his own purpose, his own truth. The men who die with regret are not the ones who failed. They are the ones who succeeded at the wrong things. He had seen it before: the man who climbed the corporate ladder only to realize too late that he hated the view from the top. The man who spent decades building a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow within. The man who followed the expectations of others so perfectly that he lost himself in the process. He refused to be that man. So he stripped away every external definition of success and asked himself a question that most men are too afraid to ask: what do I truly want? Not what would impress others. Not what was expected of him. Not what seemed logical or practical. But what, if he pursued it relentlessly, would make him feel alive. For the first time, he stopped measuring himself by the standards of others. He no longer cared how his version of success compared to someone else's. He no longer needed approval to validate his choices. Because success was no longer about how the world saw him. It was about how he saw himself. And that kind of success? The kind that is built on truth rather than expectation? That is the only kind worth chasing. Chapter 14. Becoming the man you respect. There was a time when he measured himself by the respect of others. He had spent years seeking their approval, adjusting his words and actions to fit their expectations, believing that if enough people admired him, then he would finally feel worthy. But respect that is built on external validation is fragile. It can be taken away as easily as it is given. It forces a man to perform, to shape himself around the shifting opinions of the world, to live in constant fear of falling short. True respect, the kind that cannot be lost, cannot be shaken, cannot be taken away, comes from only one place. A man must respect himself first. He had seen men who were admired by many yet hollow inside. They had power, wealth, influence, but they lacked something fundamental, a deep, unshakable self-respect. When they were alone, away from the praise and attention, they felt small. Because deep down, they knew the truth. They had compromised too much. They had cut corners, broken promises to themselves, taken the easy path when they should have stood firm. He refused to live that way. So he asked himself a question that most men never dare to confront. If I were not me, if I were looking at myself from the outside, would I respect the man I see? Not admire. Not envy. Respect. Because respect is not about charm or success or how well a man plays the game of appearances. It is about who he is when no one is watching. It is about the choices he makes when there is no reward, the discipline he keeps when there is no audience, the way he stands by his own code even when it costs him. A man who respects himself does not need validation from others. He does not seek permission to be who he is. He does not compromise his integrity for temporary approval. And because of this, the world eventually respects him anyway. But the difference is, by then, he no longer needs it. He had spent too much of his life chasing the respect of others. That chase ended today. From now on, his only concern was becoming a man he could look in the mirror and respect. Because in the end, that is the only respect that truly matters. Conclusion. The final reflection. Who you are versus who you can be. He stood in front of the mirror one last time. But this time, something was different. The face looking back at him was the same features, same eyes, same scars that life had given him. But the way he saw himself had changed. He was no longer searching for something, no longer trying to avoid what he might see. There was no hesitation in his stare, no doubt, no unspoken shame. For the first time in his life, he recognized himself fully. The man in the mirror was not perfect. He still had weaknesses, still had battles to fight, still had room to grow. But he was no longer afraid of himself. He had faced his own reflection and had refused to look away. He had confronted the truths that most men spend their entire lives avoiding. And because of that, he was free. The world had not changed. The challenges ahead were still there. The weight of responsibility, The tests of discipline, the need for resilience, all of it remained. But the difference now was that he trusted himself to face it. He no longer needed permission to act, nor approval to validate his path. He no longer sought shortcuts or excuses. He was no longer waiting for change. He had become it. This journey had never been about becoming someone new. It had been about returning to who he truly was before fear, doubt, and expectation shaped him into something smaller. It had been about reclaiming his own mind, his own choices, his own power. Now, he understood what most men never do. No one is coming to save you. You are responsible for your own transformation. Confidence is not something you find. It is something you build through discipline and action. Strength is not given. It is earned through the trials you refuse to run from. Respect does not come from others first. It comes from living in a way that makes you respect yourself. This was never about perfection. It was about power, the kind that comes from full ownership of one's life. He took one last look at himself, knowing that the man in the mirror would never be a stranger again. And then, with steady hands and clear eyes, he stepped forward into the life that was now fully his.